Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from today. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome all of our participants for what will be a riveting discussion of the future of intelligence. We're very excited to have our very own Mike Rogers here to moderate a conversation with Sir David Omand about his book, How Spies Think, and also generally where things are going with intelligence. CSPC has for over 55 years been convening key players in both the executive and legislative branches of the US government and members of the private sector, and also exploring with our key partners and allies where we can cooperate best to promote US national interests. And our conversation today will be a continuation of that series. We have been focusing on great power competition recently for obvious reasons. Intelligence plays such an important part in our ability as a country and as a group of countries to compete for our national security goals. Mike Rogers was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and played a really key role in that intersection between politics, legislation, and the practitioners of the intelligence community who go out and do the hard work and take the big risks to deliver us the intelligence that drives our national security decision making. And Sir David has been on the front lines to say both the UK Ministry of Defense and held many key senior intelligence leadership positions in the United Kingdom, a key Five Eyes ally of the United States. So is in a very good position to deliver some insights about the future of intelligence. I just want to quickly plug our own Joshua Huminski's work in reviewing Sir David's book, How Spies Think. And I'm going to drop in the chat a link to his book review for the benefit of our audience. And I encourage you to take a look at that and to check out the book. With that, as I mentioned, we're very proud to have at CSPC the Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs, led by none other than Chairman Mike Rogers, our good friend and my bipartisan partner in our work, who's really at the cutting edge and is the expert on these things. So without further ado, Mike, let me turn over the floor to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. And Sir David, you have one very unique qualification after today, and that's the most effusive book review I've ever seen from our very own Joshua Huminski, who's a tough grader. And he went on. I mean, it was. I encourage our listeners to get out there and take a look at just the review, let alone read the book, and made me want to read it twice. It was so good. So I appreciate that. I am honored to have such a great practitioner of the intelligence business here, somebody who's committed their life and career to keeping both the United States, Great Britain, and all of our allies safe, because of that very special relationship we have. So we had with us David Omand, who's the very first security coordinator for the intelligence services in the United Kingdom. He's been in the Ministry of Defense. He's been the Deputy Secretary for Policy, that long-term strategic thinking, which he is well known for. The director of the GCHQ, which is our version of the NSA. He's a United Kingdom Defense Counselor at NATO in Brussels, and author of How Spies Think, which he lets us peek behind the curtain a little bit. So, Sir David, if you want to give us some framing remarks, that would be good. I do say maybe my first question is going to be about the Sir in that Sir David Omand and your knighting. We're very excited. As Anglophiles on this side of the pond, we're very interested, but I don't want you to be intimidated when you get there. I am a freeman of the city of London. And I know that you might be envious of that, but I think you'll probably get over it pretty quickly. So without further ado, I give you a great intelligence official, great friend of the United States, and somebody who has just tremendous insight into not only where we've been in intelligence, but what the future might look like. So, Sir David, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, and thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. It's great to be talking to somebody who really does understand what intelligence is about. I started writing this book when I was watching the Brexit referendum back in the United Kingdom, and then saw in the 2016 US presidential election what was happening on social media. And what I saw, what we all saw, was half-truths, some falsehoods, some deceptions, and many coming from Russia, but not all coming from Russia, and aimed at setting people at each other's throats. And there was a general feeling around that truth no longer seemed as important as creating the desired emotional impact. The RAND Corporation came out with that report on truth decay. And there was a feeling that, I'd like it to be true, becomes, if it's repeated often enough, it might be true. And that kind of slides into, well, for me, it's as good as true, and I'm going to act as if it's true. And that's what we saw with the Capitol riot. And it kind of leads me to ask, and this is really what the book is about, what do you need to know to take sound evidence-based decisions? And whether you're a president or a cabinet member, whether you're a general, whether you're a senior police officer, what do you need to know to take a sound decision? And then you can extrapolate that into all of us when we have big decisions to take. What outputs should we look to the analytic community, particularly in government, look to the intelligence community to provide? And how do we prevent emotions and prejudices and cognitive biases distorting our decision? I know in the US and in the UK, we try to keep professional advice separate from political calculation, because we don't want the perception that the advice might be politicized. But in the end, these types of thinking have to come together inside a single mind. You've got our desires for what we want to achieve by our choice, or our fears over what we want to avoid by a decision. And on the other hand, rational analysis of the situation we're facing and the options open. And both kinds of thought, the values-driven what ought to be and the dispassionate what is, need to be integrated if we're going to take sound decisions. And my observation, which is why I wrote the book, was, my goodness, it's getting harder in the world of social media. So the start of my book is saying, what do we need to know? And the answer is, I think, four kinds of output, four outputs from rational analysis. And helpfully, they form an acronym: SEAS, Situational Awareness, Explanation, Estimation, and Strategic Notice. And I genuinely think it helps if you unbundle analysis and start thinking about, some of it's about situational awareness, what, when, and where are things happening in cyberspace or the real world. Explanation, which for me is the bit we have most often got wrong. We haven't really understood why the adversary is acting in the way the adversary is. If you've got a good explanation, you can then begin to estimate how might things unfold, which of course is what the decision maker really wants to know, what's going to happen. And then you can do some modeling on this assumption or that assumption. If you take this action or that action, how will things unfold? And then when you're busy doing all of that, experience is something completely unexpected comes and hits you on the back of the head because you weren't paying attention. And so the final S in my acronym, SEES, is strategic notice, looking ahead, trying to work out how could you be less surprised by surprise, because you've built up resilience, you've taken some precautionary measures, you've created some intelligence requirements. So that's really the logic of the book, based on the fact that I think it is getting harder for decision makers to take rational decisions when we're just surrounded by so much conspiracy theorizing, half-truths, half-imagined truths, and some downright deception in the gray zone. And there are going to be more countries doing that to us, is my prediction in the future. So that's basically the pitch in the book. I think you're on. You're mute.
As I say, Sir David, I do my best work on mute. I thank you for
It's
that.
like they used to say to me, "You've got a great face for radio."
Yeah, exactly. I got the same thing. I don't know, and I have 4 older brothers. It actually got worse from there. And again, the book I think is so well rationed and reasoned through your C's approach. Can you talk a little bit how you would apply that to modern day misinformation? So what we've seen is certainly the Russians have mastered it, but they've been doing this for decades. They just now have access to us in our home laptops, which they didn't have before. And now we see other countries joining in. China's trying to do it, certainly in the Pacific Rim, and we see Iran is even trying it in their sphere of influence. And what we know is if they can perfect it there, it'll go everywhere else soon, coming to a theater near you. Can you talk about how you think that maybe as policymakers or as intelligence professionals presenting information to policymakers, we can try to cut through this misinformation that is so prevalent in these information operations?
Yeah. Well, the first step is situational awareness. Do we really know what's going on? I mean, I think 2016 was a big wake-up year because we hadn't seen it coming. Now, maybe we should have done, but the antennae weren't there. The head of MI5, our domestic security service, was quizzed on why they hadn't been looking out for Russian interference in British elections. And because that's, I suppose, counter-subversion is the job of FBI in your case and security service in ours. And the answer was, well, we don't do politics. We don't look at domestic politics. The possibility of that kind of threat, manipulative information being covertly injected, hadn't really registered as something that the intelligence community needed to check. So my first point would be, do you really know what's going on? And that's not entirely straightforward. It needs the cooperation of the big tech giants, which I think they would now give. A few years ago, they might have been more reticent, but now I think they would cooperate to try and get identified toxic material. Then the explanation part, is this, is there a wider agenda here, for example, on the part of Russia, to destabilize faith in democracy? Or is it just troublemaking on the grounds that everything that's bad for the United States will be good for us and vice versa, which is probably Putin's sort of zero-sum game calculus? But is there some specific agendas? Because those need to be identified, because you may need to take some very specific measures to deal with it. So that explanation part, which is hard because you really need to know a lot about the adversary. And that, of course, I don't want to just talk about Russia because, as you say, we see both Russia and China, particularly, for example, in Africa, engaging in using sort of information as a weapon. So you've got that, but then you can begin to think about estimating and modeling. So if we took certain kinds of countermeasures, how is the adversary going to respond? If you've got your cyber command to actually start doing some forward activity, what's going to happen? And you need to have some pretty good feel for modeling that before you authorize people to start doing that kind of stuff. Otherwise, you might be quite badly surprised. And the fourth letter of C's, the strategic notice, is looking for the unexpected some way ahead. Other countries may join in. There may be attempts to use not just fake news sites and bots to amplify tweets and so on. Are there other techniques that are going to be employed against us, which we don't yet really understand and know about? So get some research done on those. So that's the kind of analysis, pick it apart and then really focus in, try and build up that confidence that you know what's going on and you know which of the options that are open to you are likely to have the biggest effect.
Yeah, well, and you talked a little bit about offensive operations, and I heard in there a very subtle, in only the way the British can, suggestion that maybe we should be more forward-leaning on offensive operations, which I would not disagree with you, sir. In a recent podcast, your successor, Jeremy Fleming, talked a little bit about the ISIS offensive cyber campaign. And what kind of lessons do you think we can take away from that particular campaign as we need to apply it to a more sophisticated adversary?
I'd use the phrase, deterrence by denial. You want to make it as hard for the adversary to score points as possible. And there's going to be no magic silver bullet on this, but can you actually degrade the adversary's capacity? If you're talking about grey zone operations aimed at the American public or the British public, can you make it much harder for them? They had an easy ride in 2016. They had a harder ride in 2020. Why? Situational awareness had built up. It was known what they were up to, and some steps were taken. So I think there is the possibility. Now, this is where I think I would also say, make sure you really know what you're doing before you authorize it, because some of these things could go quite badly wrong. You attempt to slow down a particular flow of information, so you knock the server out in one way or another. You didn't realize, because you didn't have the intel, that this is also serving some other purpose. And before you know where you are, there's been a cascading effect, and the IT of a hospital has gone down. You really don't want to be in that position.
Which is why a lot of people have this debate about offensive cyber operations. So how would you see this going forward then in that? Because I think attribution has gotten a lot better. From when we first started looking at this, that was the big hurdle to get over on offensive cyber operation. Could you accurately attribute who is actually conducting either the information operation or the operation?
But there is a difference, Mike, isn't there, between when you say accurately, it depends for what purpose. If you were talking about a court of law, you would probably say, no, it's not quite an evidential standard. There's a lot of inference in there, or circumstantial evidence, which is good enough for an intelligence community to be able to say, we're onto something here, we're going to double the amount of effort, we're really going to look into this, and we're going to take more precautions. Is it good enough to take that further step and say we're going to retaliate? Well, rather than just degrade, we're going to hit something else, because we want to send a message to the adversary. We're not prepared to put up with this. That's where you have the danger of escalation. If it was, let's say, North Korea, then you might have to pause and think a well-networked state is going to lose out in a tit-for-tat escalation. So at this point, you probably want to also start conveying some serious messages about what starts in cyberspace may not end in cyberspace. So if serious damage is done, as I think, well, certainly the last president, John Bolton, I think, issued a statement to say that on behalf of the president that the United States reserves the right to respond at the time and means of its own choosing, which is one of those phrases that comes out of nuclear deterrence. It's quite useful. So I would also make a distinction between what we call active defense and offensive cyber. And this is not just a play on words, because passive defense is just sitting back, erecting barriers and hoping they'll stop the enemy. And we all know that's unlikely to be fully effective. They'll get inside. So you need active defense, and that can be quite active, but it's still entirely defensive. You're not, as it were, trying to intimidate the other side. You're just making it very difficult for them.
And that's your denial.
Yeah.
That's that part of that denial campaign, denying them the opportunity to do what they're doing.
Yeah. And there could be cases where you want to go beyond that and actually send a much firmer message that it will actually hurt the other side if they do this.
Yeah.
And again, you've got to think about, is that only when they are engaged in certain kinds of activity? Would you do that for an espionage operation like solar wind?
Mm-hmm.
Because every advanced state has espionage capabilities. We all do it, and we try and do it decently. And there are norms that we try and stick to, and we have authorities we acquire, and we've got independent oversight and the House committees and all the rest of it. And the adversary may not have all of that, but nonetheless, we are engaged in intelligence gathering for our own national interests. So, but we're not engaged in trying to undermine the, say, democratic values that we actually believe in. We believe in those values, and our operations are infused with those values. On the other side, that's not true. So these are the kinds, I make it sound more complicated than it needs to be, but you can see the way one needs to sort of think through, because nothing stays secret these days for very long. And so what we all do has to be justifiable to our democracies, justifiable to our publics. So we've got to think this through before we start doing too much.
Yeah. And you had an interesting point about this being an espionage operation. I have said that frequently and give a lot of talks on the solar winds and how they're trade craft. But in the beginning, there were policymakers who came out and said, this is an act of war, which was it took me aback a little bit, because it clearly was not an act of war. It was an act of a very unfortunate, successful espionage for its intended targets. Matter of fact, I think it was wildly successful, even more successful than they assumed it would be. And so how do we level set this conversation that you just had with policymakers? How do you bridge that gap between, our members, your members of parliament, our members of Congress, people who are going to get access to this, who may not understand the difference between espionage, attack, destruction?
It's a great question. It's a great question. My experience would be that policymakers do understand policy arguments.
Yeah.
So one of the policy arguments that you can deploy here is precisely the one about if you make sort of major pronouncements, this is an act of war, and you don't follow up as if genuinely it was an act of war, then the message, this is the policy argument, the message you're sending to the adversary is, actually, we got away with that one. And we all remember what happened when, I don't want to go into the detail, but President Obama did not follow through on Syria and chemical weapons. And, a lot of people around the world sort of drew a conclusion from that despite all the talk about prohibited weapons and so on, when it came to it, we weren't going to act. So I think if you make a threat, which is essentially what you do when you say this is an act of war, you're implying there is going to be a response which is commensurate. And you've got to be pretty careful that ensure that you're actually able to and want to follow through on that. The less said about espionage, the better. It's a not a bad rule.
As director,
and I say that having written a book, but all the anecdotes in my book, I hasten to say to your listeners or watchers, all the anecdotes in my book are taken from the policy parts of my career, not from the intelligence service part of my career.
You didn't have a pullout of all the operational details? What's going on? That would have been an interesting book indeed. Right. So can you talk about the couple of things on this? So we talked about the misinformation campaigns. We've talked about trying to have a better assessment of what their intentions are with those campaigns and how they're conducting them. I think that's where you were laying out that case. How do we operate in a very digital world? How does a brand new spy today operate in this digital world? I mean, the challenges of this are immense. And I don't know if you've had a chance to think that through and love your thoughts on it. I know on this side of the pond, there's some wrestling going on about what that looks like.
Yeah. By coincidence, there's a story in the Times of London newspaper today saying that it's MI6, our secret service, has made it known that they're going to relax the requirements on dual nationality. So that at the moment you have to have a very clear pedigree of Britishness all the way through before they'll consider recruiting you as an intelligence officer. As an agent, of course, you could be any nationality under the sun. Right. But as an intelligence officer, the problem with the traditional approach these days is our adversaries around the world will have a pretty good idea of who's on the list. The Chinese hack into the OPM in Washington has probably given them a pretty good list as well. So today, I think you have to rethink how some of these human intelligence operations are conducted. And recognize that the movements of particularly the more senior members of the intelligence community are going to be tracked in close detail. That may not matter where they're overtly visiting their opposite numbers in country X, but it could matter. So I think that kind of a thinking through, do we need to have more operations which are not conducted in the traditional, this is a case officer who is running people in country X. And a certain amount of that's already been going on over the last few years anyway. It's probably just got to accelerate. They tell me, I've never tried to do it myself, but they tell me that faking a social media backstory is actually very difficult.
Yes.
Because I think it was Professor R.V. Jones, the founder of scientific intelligence during the Second World War, who said the way to spot deception is you have to look at as many channels as possible. Because to get all the potential channels of information lined up with the fake story at the right time sequence is actually extraordinarily hard. Yeah. And I think getting the social media history and everything that could be deduced from it in the right, if you've made the whole thing up, is quite tricky. It might get you passed into the country through a border check, but it's not going to survive detailed scrutiny. And that has some consequences for how you go about recruiting young people and perhaps allowing them to generate careers outside the intelligence community before then calling them in to do their work.
Yeah. Matter of fact, there's, as I'm sure you're aware of the gap problem, where people had a gap in social media getting ready to their next career in life, maybe in the intelligence business, let's just say, was creating huge problems. And then the transfer and the bridge, you can't just one day stop.
The same is true in SIGINT, because where some people's telephones suddenly go quiet
right.
at 8 in the morning, and then they don't go back online till 6 in the evening, they're probably going into some form of skiff.
Right. Yeah.
And that kind of analysis, rather like the data that Strava dumped of all those wearable fitness bracelets,
right.
And they dumped trillions of GPS data points of their global collection. And somebody's already identified a US Special Forces base because of the pattern that at certain time in the morning, out they go for their long run around the base.
Exactly. One more reason not to run, I say. Kidding, I'm kidding, everyone. You should get your exercise. So if you think about that, what does that mean? What does the intelligence community do on operations where you absolutely have to do it? So you think about, you have all the signals and digital data and digital fingerprints that you have to worry about. I mean, does this change the way espionage works in the future completely? Or do you think that there's still some old school games that are going to be applicable in today's world?
Well, my hunch, and it's only a hunch, is that the inventiveness of the human intelligence community and their sort of technical departments, the Qs of this world, if you follow they're going to come up with ways of continuing to be in business, but it's going to require more attention. On the other hand, the upside of all of this is that all these data sources provide input for intelligence on our potential adversaries and the criminal groups and the terrorist gangs and all the rest of it, because they too are leaving digital footprints.
Right. Yeah. And I agree. There's been some interesting studies, let me rephrase that, in trying to look at what even the new digital 5G IoT device connected digital world looks like if you are trying to conduct operations. And to me, it's fascinating. I agree. I think there are some brilliant minds in that Q shop, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm still waiting for my Aston Martin that I thought you all promised me on my last visit. I'm very upset by that. Hasn't shown up yet. But I do believe that there's probably going to be both. I just think that the way we conduct human operations will change, and it's already changing. Yeah. And it's probably likely going to be smaller in footprint than it used to be. And it wasn't huge before. Yeah. And then this our new integration for digital collection and understanding and analytics of digital understanding is going to fundamentally change the way we look at the world. So
at the heart of it, there are probably two. One is that the really well-placed human source who really genuinely wants to help you.
Yes.
Because for any one of the reasons that's still invaluable, because that gives you insight into what the machines can't see, which is motivation.
Yeah, that intent is so important.
And the other thing is that the type of source of agent will change. In the future, the person who has access to the servers and the networks is going to be just as valuable as the third secretary in an embassy in country Z.
Yes. Well, I have to tell you, as a former FBI guy, always into the counterintelligence side of the business, if you could ever get a Soviet code clerk, promote right away, don't pass go, collect your $200. It was a big, big, big day to get that. Well, nowadays, that code clerk is your systems administrator on any network. So you went from a very small group of potential targets that could work against you to this massive list of individuals that now become of interest to foreign adversaries, even in our own country, let alone the same kind of people we might be interested in having a conversation with. To me, that is a fundamental change in ways we haven't seen. And how do you protect those very senior officials? The challenge is huge because we're so connected, so digital. And we know, and there's been public reports on assets that have been lost or agents that have been lost because of poor digital tradecraft. We're getting into a new world and a better understanding, but boy, that is something that really smart folks are going to have to figure out really quickly. Don't you agree?
I do agree. And one thing, of course, it's a very obvious point, is that everyone has got to become more savvy.
Yes.
In this field, not just this specialist. This is the digital world and its exploitation, both by us and to us, on us. Everyone has to have more the understanding of that than they currently do. The moment it's for the techies. You don't really have to understand that, to be the head of station somewhere, dangerous, doing remarkable work. Well, in future, you are going to have really quite a lot of insight. And that's going to mean quite a lot of training and retraining and persuading the policymakers as well. They're going to have to know now some of where this information that's reaching them is coming from. And we're going to have to trust the intelligence community to own up and say, actually, this is an inference from a bit of artificial intelligence that we have applied, and that's what has identified this farmhouse in remote Afghanistan or whatever else. We've never actually seen it with a naked eye. This has come out of machine learning.
Yeah, no, exactly. You were pretty candid in your book about some failures, some inability to get it right. And I've never, intelligence is never 100% of the puzzle. It's always a percentage of the puzzle, and you hope you can analyze what the picture might look like. Can you talk a little bit about that? It was kind of refreshing and to see that, hey, listen, this is a business that doesn't have all the information, but is expected to give you the best picture we can.
Yeah.
And you laid out some of the difficulties and challenges. I think that's a really interesting portion of that. And I wonder if you'd talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I've structured the book around 10 lessons in intelligence. And lesson number 1 is our knowledge of the world is always fragmentary, incomplete, and is sometimes wrong. And I was a member of the UK Joint Intelligence Committee in 1982, 83, 2002 and 2003, when we got the assessment on Iraq not quite right. I mean, some of it was right, but some major parts of it we didn't get right. And that's a story, part of that story I recount in the book, because it illustrates all the problems you run into. Not that anyone manufactured intelligence on our side.
Yeah.
It was the cognitive biases of seeing what we wanted to see, rather than anything else. And there was some deliberate deception. And we talked earlier in this conversation about deception. Well, we had a defection being fed from the famous curveball on Iraqi BW. And it illustrates, I think, rather well the difficulties, because here you've got an Iraqi chemical engineer who had worked on his biological warfare programs when they existed. And he turns up with the German service, and almost 100 reports come out into the Pentagon and into the Ministry of Defense in London. And of course, they're technically spot on because he's an expert. The trouble is, he'd made it up because he wanted the invasion of Iraq to take place. Right. So that's very difficult to suss out.
And you know what was interesting about that is, from our side of the pond, is that when that body of work was out throughout the intelligence committee, it created other bodies of work that affirmed and took one more step forward on that same information based on that, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's an eternal truth, isn't it? If you believe in a proposition and you go looking for evidence, you will always find some evidence.
Yeah.
You may not actually be looking for and have found any contrary evidence because you weren't looking for it, or you may have found it and put it to one side because it didn't seem as compelling as the other evidence. And this is unconscious. You don't know you're doing this. It's not deliberate misleading. It's unconscious, which is why I always think analysis is a team sport.
Yes. And one thing that I instituted as chairman is I wanted to see the dissension even after an agreement. Now, in some intelligence circles, drives them crazy. They don't want you to, like, this is our conclusion, take our conclusion. But I thought it was important to read through some of the dissenting arguments or views. Not that it would change my mind or change the conclusion, but I just think it's important that there can be some checks and balances in that within the community. Can you talk a little bit about the work of dissent? You've seen it both ways, where some, in some cases, no dissension allowed, some cases a little bit, some cases, hey, welcome aboard, let's hear it all. Can you walk me through that?
I spent 7 years as a member of the British Joint Intelligence Committee, and the argument on this kept coming up. And we always took a rather traditional view that it doesn't help a prime minister, or indeed a president, to be told that the Air Force thinks this, but the Navy thinks that. What are you supposed to do? Yeah. So the British tradition was you just keep arguing and you keep digging further and further back in the evidential trail till you find why it is that there's this disagreement. And this was often done across the Atlantic because the US analysts might have come to a different conclusion, often did. And when you tracked it down, it usually came down to, there's a bit of information, there's some reporting here that one side has and the other side hasn't. And when finally they get around to sharing it, then it converges. So we were rather against revealing in a Joint Intelligence Committee paper, attributing different views. So it was consensus. I think in the end that's helpful to the decision maker. But where we, as it were, should have done more was exposing to the committee itself where analysts were arguing. And the other point is we should have exposed to our political masters, we should have said, look, this conclusion rests like an inverted pyramid on a very small number of reports. And then I think it would have been perfectly reasonable for the ministers to politicians turn around and say, well, right, show me those reports. And I want to be reassured that the inference you've drawn from this reporting is solid. As it was, I suspect they never had that conversation. So I think, and this certainly might well have been true for Colin Powell, your end, they never quite realized that there wasn't that much solid intelligence. There was a lot of inference and deduction. And the few reports there were tended to come from sub-sources and sub-sub-sources. And there's always the danger that if your source really understands what you are looking for, they're going to try and find it because they want to please.
Right.
Because they're genuinely trying to help.
Right.
It's not that they want to deceive you, they want to help, and if this is what you want. So in the end, a lot of that material got withdrawn after the war when it was all checked out. So we could have done better. I think the conclusion of the US inquiry into all of that you can't be expected to get it all right, but you should have been less wrong. Right. I think that hits it. That's about right. But in the book, I also do relate some successes.
Yeah.
Such as the wonderful Gordievsky case, where the man who has been the KGB officer who's been put in charge of the KGB Residentura in London is actually working for MI6.
Yeah.
So when Margaret Thatcher comes to meet Gorbachev for the first time, Thatcher's brief has been in part written by the MI6's agent, Gordievsky, and so has Gorbachev's brief, because so she knew what points he was going to raise. She had all the arguments to deal with those points. No wonder the meeting was a great success, she said.
Well, in the FBI, we would call that a good day when you're
Yes.
getting the resident.
They can't all be like that, but it's
No,
nice when you get them. It's nice when you get them.
Oh, it sure is. And that operation went on for a while, if I recall.
Yes, indeed. And in the end, he was, I'm afraid, betrayed, which can happen. So it's rather a sad story, because I think over-enthusiasm in Langley as to who is this source that the Brits must have because they're producing good stuff. And unfortunately, somebody called Ames was working in that shop. And so he didn't know the name, but it was enough to tip off Moscow to start looking around. And eventually, of course, he had to be extracted. First time, I think somebody had actually been covertly extracted from the Soviet Union in that way. It's a great operation. And then, of course, once out, he continued to advise, and he came over. He met your president a couple of times.
No, it was quite an intelligence coup for, I think, for MI6, and it served us well. Unfortunately, we had a traitor, a real traitor, in our midst, which in intelligence operations, as we've all said, can happen on both sides of that pond. We've
at our end as well, I'm afraid.
Yes. Unfortunate indeed. We won't even go into the Cambridge Five, for just gets my blood going just even thinking about it. And I know we have a list of questions and I want to get to those, but go ahead, please.
No, I'm just going to say the interesting thing is the way in which, at the time, just before and during the Second World War, there were ideological spies on behalf of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union and the United States were fighting Nazi Germany. Right. After 56 and the invasion and the suppression of the uprising, and then after 68 and Czechoslovakia and suppression of their freedom, the Warsaw Pact and basically they had to bribe people. They had to find character weaknesses or bribe them. They didn't really have ideological agents, and it was a neat inverse, because that's when CIA and SIS started getting people walking in because they were fed up with the Soviet regime, and they wanted to help bring an end to the Soviet regime, sort of ideological spies, but the other way around. So there's been an interesting reversion in the space of 50 years.
Yeah. There is still a large cadre of agents who the almighty pound or dollar speaks their language. Which is, if they're helping the United States or our allies in Britain, I'm for it, but it sure makes you scratch your head, doesn't it? It's the psychology of that activity. So I'm going to turn it over. Dan Mahaffey is going to take some audience questions here, but while he's getting ready to do that, as I mentioned earlier, I get to take my sheep across the bridge at no toll because I'm a freeman of the City of London. What comes with being a knight? Do you get any such great opportunity?
Well, they say better tables in restaurants, but
does that? You're not convinced?
I'm not convinced of that.
That's great. I'm going to turn it over to Dan Mahaffey, who's going to take some audience questions. I could go all day, and I look forward when you get to the States for a dinner. We're going to talk about all those agent and operations over a really nice bottle of wine, if that's appealing.
That sounds great.
I'm all in. Thank you, Sir David. And Dan, would you mind opening up to some questions from the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Mike and Sir David. The first question, and some of the ones I see here from the audience, and it's a fitting segue from some of the last comments we had. Talk about also inflicting financial pain on our adversaries, be it kleptocrats, hackers, criminals. How can, in your estimation, the intelligence community better work with the financial sector to understand where the bad guys are keeping the cash as well as to hit them in the pocketbook?
Great question. I don't know how it's done in the US. I think it's not an area I've worked on directly, but I know in the UK, that is exactly what is going on. I mean, there's a big push within the City of London to identify dirty money. Some of it sort of adversary figures, some of it just straight criminal, particularly narcotics money. And you're going to need intelligence skills. So the National Crime Agency in the UK works very closely with both GCHQ and the other two British agencies. The problems arise less in identifying and more in peacetime conditions. How do you deal with this? Are you going to go through the processes of the law? You've got the act now, so there's a better chance that you could actually seize assets. But if it's going to end up in a court and you've used very sensitive methods to get your evidence, then that's another consideration, which is not entirely straightforward. A covert, deniable operation is a different matter. But I personally am convinced it is one of the few things that would really create a major shockwave if some of the those who clearly have benefited from the breakup of the old Soviet Union suddenly discovered that the money they had put aside overseas was at risk. I don't think I'll say any more than that.
Right.
But it's great. It's absolutely the right question to ask.
Yeah. The next question, and along the theme, and you touched on it a bit on your comments, but to pull a little further on the thread of how you recruit new skills, new backgrounds, building more diverse intelligence services. You talked briefly about citizenship rules, but other ways you can recruit. One question here specifically focuses on language skills and offering citizenship to talented folks. How does recruiting affect the mission and the future of intelligence?
Well, I think my approach would be to say, are you going to rethink how some of the ICE intelligence community works? Is this any longer a career? You come out of college, you get recruited at a college fair, you work away in the sort of the mines of analysis, and then gradually you work your way up. And likewise, you find, say after some time in the military, you get recruited in to operational work. Or are we much more open to late career entries, people who've made careers elsewhere? Are we open to different kinds of association? And the French have this expression, honorable correspondant, who is somebody who can always be approached to help, but isn't a full-time on the payroll. So good intelligence agencies build up networks of people who can help, but do you want to take that a stage further, particularly when you may need to tap into some very specialist expertise, and pay a retainer, have them as advisors, create different modes in which you can tap the expertise that is available and the knowledge base of people that are available. Another area is using the academic community rather more, both for peer review and just as sounding boards, where they don't need to know the secrets, but the old tradition of staying well away from the experts on a particular region are probably over.
And then the final question before I turn it back to Mike and Glenn for any closing comments, would be the interest we see growing towards domestic espionage in countries. And what would be your advice to policymakers as they look? You know, you mentioned there was the former line, we don't do politics, but as the intelligence communities are increasingly drawn into that, what would be your advice for policymakers?
Yeah, well, to take the British case is relatively straightforward because the intelligence community is governed by a couple of acts of parliament, which lay down 3 reasons, and only 3, why you can turn on this intelligence machine, regardless of whether it's domestic or overseas. National security, and that must include a grey zone activity, detection and prevention of serious crime, and protecting the nation from the sort of economic harm that could be caused by people outside. So the detection and prevention of serious crime, for example, certainly means that the external agencies, GCHQ and the Secret Service, working overseas, where there are links back in, subversive links, shall we say, in terms of, you link up with MI5, who would be looking for the sort of sleeper agents, the sort of Anna Chapmans of this world. But the external agencies would have a role too. And in the end, what may come out of it is a criminal prosecution because some election law has been broken or whatever it might be. I'm just speculating. But you can see how you can put the pieces together to conduct a perfectly proper, above the board examination of how do you protect the nation against people outside who are determined to try and subvert it. Now, it's not the way over the last few years we've focused so much on counterterrorism that we've been applying exactly that model to the jihadist terrorists, where all the agencies and the law enforcement have been working together jointly, joint mission planning and all the rest of it. But we haven't sort of applied that to the grey zone yet. And that's obviously something that's, I suspect, is going on as we speak. Oh, I like the dog.
Yeah, my guest agent showing up here. So that'll cover it from the audience. Thank you, Sir David.
If I could, I just wanted to add, just say thank you. First of all, big thanks to Mike Rogers for his leadership and oversight of intelligence and for leading a great conversation today. And Sir David, thank you for being with us. I always observed as an elected official the challenges of public perception of the intelligence community and their work, not least of which because it is made up of people who agree to take on difficult tasks for little thank you, especially public thank you, given the fact that their work is largely secret, and also because the nature of the work is such that your best outcome is often an event not happening versus something happening that you could attribute to the men and women that work in the intelligence community. But we deeply appreciate your service and what you've done both for the UK, the US, the Five Eyes community, and the world. And I hope that your book helps that public perception and improving in the eye of the public the notion of the challenges that intelligence professionals face. So thank you for taking on that work. More importantly, thank you for spending this hour with us today. And we hope to have you back sometime. Mike, let me turn it back to you for any closing words.
Gosh, no, Sir David, thank you very, very much. Again, thank you for your distinguished career in keeping the United Kingdom and helping out your ally, the United States, along the way. We certainly appreciate it. And again, I look forward to that in-person meeting. And the wine is on me. Trust me. Thank you, sir.
Very
and by
good.
the way,
thanks, Mike.
The Way Spies Think, everyone. You want to pick that up. It's a great book.
Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone for being with us.
Guys.
Take care. Be well. Bye-bye.